People have come to Gettysburg to see the famous battlefield ever since the smoke of battle cleared. This is where the decisive engagement of the American Civil War was fought, one of the most significant battles in all of military history. Millions of words have been written, analyzing the strategy and detailing the stories of the two huge American armies that met as enemies at Gettysburg. More men fell here than in any other battle ever fought in North America. This lush Pennsylvania countryside is quiet now. Gettysburg is still in good part a farming community as it was at the time of the Civil War. A number of old farmhouses from that era still stand. Before the war, Gettysburg was a thriving crossroads community with a well-known college. But the town was changed forever when war came here. Battle damage was eventually repaired, but the area became a place of striking contrasts, and this is still true today. Here, cannon and war memorials are blended into the peaceful pastoral scene as they are in few places on earth. For the first-time visitor to Gettysburg, it's probably the enormous number and variety of monuments here that make the strongest initial impression. There are markers and memorials of all shapes and sizes. In most cases, they're located in places where the person or group commemorated figured prominently in the action of battle. The old adversaries, Union General Meade and Confederate General Lee, still face each other across the broad, sloping field where Pickett's charge took place. General Robert E. Lee, who had had a series of victories, invaded Pennsylvania hoping for another success that would dishearten the North still further and might promote foreign aid and recognition for the Confederacy. General George Meade had assumed command of the Northern Army only 3 days before the battle began. His defensive posture at Gettysburg proved to be the strategy that led to victory. The full story of the battle can be complex, but the National Park Service offers interpretive exhibits and talks that make it clear. At the Visitor Center, there's an electric map that uses colored lights to explain the 3-day battle. Gettysburg was the turning point of the Civil War, an epic conflict that determined America's course for the future. After a brief skirmish west of town, a chance encounter that surprised both sides, the Battle of Gettysburg began here near McPherson's barn on the morning of July 1st, 1863. Union General John Buford dismounted his cavalry on McPherson's Ridge. His men, prepared to fight as infantry, were charged by advanced Confederate units. Union reinforcements under General John Reynolds came to Buford's aid. Not long afterwards, Reynolds, a widely admired soldier, was killed by Confederate rifle fire. General Abner Doubleday took command of Reynolds' corps. As the morning lengthened, More units on both sides were engaged. The area of battle spread to nearby Oak Ridge, and the fighting grew still fiercer. During that bloody first morning, John Burns, a citizen of Gettysburg and over 70 years of age, joined the Union lines. With his ancient musket and powder horn, he was a startling apparition on that battlefield of young men. But as one soldier who fought beside him wrote later, he was true blue and grit to the backbone, and fought until he was 3 times wounded. Not far north of McPherson's barn, a railroad cut, unfinished and without tracks at the time of the battle, turned into a trap. When the ground changed hands, 200 Southern soldiers were captured as they moved through the cut. Today, this rolling countryside where the opening engagements were fought is dominated by the Eternal Light Peace Memorial. It was dedicated in 1938 on the 75th anniversary of the battle to Peace Eternal in a Nation United. In the early afternoon of that first fateful day of fighting, Union observers in the cupola of the nearby Lutheran Seminary building reported to General Doubleday that another federal corps was approaching to join him. It was clear by now that a major confrontation was shaping up in the lovely woods and fields of Gettysburg. However, the main forces of the 2 armies still had not reached the town. Federal troops in the open fields north of town were commanded by General Oliver Howard. But General Jubal Early's Confederates hit them with overwhelming force, and Howard's position collapsed. Northern General Francis Barlow, severely wounded, had been left for dead when Confederate General John Gordon found him and gave him water. Years later, they met again. Gordon was amazed to learn that the enemy he had been kind to on the battlefield had recovered. The 2 men became firm friends. Through the day, Confederate strength had been growing faster than that of their enemy. Federal units were forced to abandon their positions north and west of Gettysburg and hastily retreated through the town. The South had carried the first day of battle. General Robert E. Lee arrived in time to witness part of the Union retreat. The disorganized Federals collected on Cemetery Hill, directly south of Gettysburg. Lee ordered a follow-up attack here, but the order was not carried out. The Federals reformed their lines here on Cemetery Hill and also on Culp's Hill and part of Cemetery Ridge, all high and advantageous positions. As additional Union troops arrived under General Slocum and others, the Federal Army was able to extend its lines south along Cemetery Ridge to Little Round Top. General Meade reached the scene during the night of July 1st. This opening day of bitter fighting was to prove only a prologue.
But oh, you'll not forget me, Mother, if I'm numbered with the slain.
The second day of battle at Gettysburg created some immortal place names in American history. Before this day, these sites were simply anonymous parts of the pastoral setting of this small farming community. Afterwards, these places, baptized with the blood of brave Americans north and south, bore names their countrymen will never forget. We remember the peach orchard, the wheat field, Devil's Den, Little Round Top. These are places Americans have read about in school. These are the places they've come to Gettysburg to see. These are names they've grown up with, and here, somehow, Billy Yank and Johnny Reb seem very close. The opposing armies were nearing their full strength by the time fighting began on July 2nd. General Meade's Army of the Potomac was arrayed in lines extending for nearly 3 miles on Culp's and Cemetery Hills and along Cemetery Ridge, south of town. General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia stretched in even more extended lines on a long, parallel rise of ground called Seminary Ridge, 2/3 of a mile or so to the west. In approximate numbers, 70,000 Southerners faced 92,000 Northerners. A fearful clash on an immense scale was about to take place. After some skirmishing in Pitzer Woods near the southern end of the Confederate lines, the major fighting on the second day began in late afternoon. Union forces had moved forward onto the high ground at the Peach Orchard and set up their battle line. The Southerners attacked, and fierce fighting developed here. One of the Confederate goals soon became Little Round Top. Whoever had guns on that high point could command the entire field of battle along Cemetery Ridge. When the Federals moved into the Peach Orchard, however, they had left Little Round Top undefended. Union General Gouverneur Warren rode to its summit, immediately saw its strategic importance, and rushed in troops and guns to secure it. Warren was later called the Savior of Gettysburg for his quick action here. Southern artillery bombarded the hill. The Confederates tried an assault, but were driven back. On the slopes of Little Round Top, men fought in hand-to-hand battle as attack was met with counterattack. The pretty valley between Devil's Den and Little Round Top was turned into the Valley of Death, and its marshy stream became Bloody Run. The smoky air was filled with the screams of the wounded and the dying. The Confederates, moving from rock to rock, pushed the Union forces from Devil's Den. This rough area of ledges and jumbled boulders provided ideal cover for Southern snipers picking off Federal soldiers on Little Round Top. The tide of battle surged around and across the wheat field, which was strewn with dead and wounded. The broken stalks of grain were soaked with Northern and Southern blood. Meanwhile, at the extreme northern end of the Union lines, at East Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, the Confederates had mounted another attack. They took and held East Cemetery Hill for a time. Although they could not dislodge the Federals from the summit of Culp's, they kept their foothold on its south slopes. War in all its horror had come to the farms and fields of Gettysburg. Civilians, however, suffered remarkably little during the battle, although houses and barns and even college buildings were turned into hospitals for the thousands of wounded. Those thousands were to multiply on the following day. Nowadays, we sometimes tend to smile at the open sentimentality of the last century. But what may seem romanticized and melodramatic today was often the expression of honest feelings then. And some of the monuments at Gettysburg can truly touch the heart. A mother finds her son's body on the field of battle. The words under the memorial read, "I yield him unto his country and his God." At the end of this second day of savage fighting, Union forces had been driven from the Peach Orchard, the wheat field, and Devil's Den. But the Federal soldiers on Little Round Top and Culp's Hill, key points at the ends of the Union lines, had held firm. General Meade's forces, more strongly entrenched than ever, were arrayed in virtually the same lines of battle they had occupied 12 hours earlier. That night in both armies, general officers discussed the strategy of battle for the following day. Perhaps the men, those on guard and those trying to sleep, thought as they do so often in war of home and loved ones, and of what the morning might bring.
Praying that we meet again.
Although there were several widely scattered actions of importance on the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg, it's the gallant Confederate attack, usually called Pickett's Charge, that has held the public's attention since that fateful 3rd of July, 1863. Here on Seminary Ridge, where the charge began, visitors can stroll around the memorials put up by several of the southern states whose sons participated. Virginia's memorial, surmounted by a handsome statue of General Lee, is by far the largest. The Tennessee monument is one of the newest in the park. The dramatic bronze group of the North Carolina Memorial was carved by Gutzon Borglum, sculptor of Mount Rushmore. Somewhat less than a mile to the east is Cemetery Ridge and the heart of the Union lines. The equestrian statue of General Meade rises above memorials to the soldiers of 17 northern states. Crowning Cemetery Ridge is the elegant, domed Pennsylvania Memorial. Around its base are bronze plaques on which are carved the names of the more than 34,000 Pennsylvanians who fought here in defense of their country, their principles, and their home state. This is the location. These are the participants in the climactic engagement of the American Civil War. Spangler's Spring had provided cool water for men of both armies during the hot days of fighting. The first action of the third day of Gettysburg occurred here and at Culp's Hill, just to the north. General Lee had determined to launch his final blow against the Army of the Potomac on July 3rd. He was convinced that his enemy was demoralized by their losses of the previous 2 days. He believed they could not withstand a massive frontal attack. But General Meade's troops had recovered their stability and morale was high. In a council of war in his headquarters, Meade and his generals had concluded that Lee would probably attack the northern center. Meade's assumptions were right, and Lee's were wrong. Part of Lee's strategy for the attack involved sending General Jeb Stuart and his cavalry around the Federal lines to strike them from behind. The mounted Confederates ran into Federal cavalrymen, and an engagement took place on what is now called East Cavalry Battlefield, about 3 miles east of Gettysburg. General David Gregg led the Union troopers. In charges and countercharges, sabers, rifles, and artillery were all in deadly use, and at last, the Confederates withdrew from the field. Today, one of the great satisfactions of visiting the Gettysburg battlefield comes from enjoying the quiet pleasures of the rural landscape. The fragrance of the just-cut hay, the warmth of the summer sun, the songs of the birds. We can be sure that many of the men who fought here enjoyed these simple things as well. But it was war that brought them to this place, and war creates a world of its own. For visitors, the Confederate charge, which was the climax of the Battle of Gettysburg, is best described in the presentation of the cyclorama in the Cyclorama Center on Cemetery Ridge. The Gettysburg cyclorama is an enormous panoramic painting of Pickett's charge created by artist Paul Philip Atteau. It's presented here in a dramatic program of light and sound. On that summer afternoon of patriotism and valor long ago, General Lee first ordered more than 130 Confederate cannon along a 2-mile front to open fire against the Federals on Cemetery Ridge. Meade was ready and returned the fire with 80 cannon of his own. It developed into one of the most savage artillery duels of the entire war. The cannon fire slackened at last. Nearly 11,000 Confederate soldiers were ordered to advance across almost a mile of open ground toward a copse of trees, the center of the Union lines. Their objective was to cut the Federal Army in two. The Confederates, marshaled by General George Pickett and others, set off in formation, colors flying directly into the guns of the enemy. Two-thirds of these men would never return to their own lines. Nearby Federal soldiers rushed up and closed in on each side of the charging Southerners. The spearhead of the Confederate charge broke through the Union lines at a place called the Angle, close to the copse of trees, their original goal. Hand-to-hand fighting raged throughout the area. The charge was stopped here, at the high water mark of the Confederacy. This was the end of the Southern invasion of the North, and later, many historians would say this was the beginning of the end of the Confederacy itself. Nearly 2 more years of bloody fighting still lay ahead, but after the magnificent, heroic, and doomed charge at Gettysburg, the North gradually gained the upper hand. On the following day, the 4th of July, 1863, an expected Federal attack did not come. In the 3 days of the battle at Gettysburg, the combined losses, North and South, in dead, wounded, and missing, totaled over 50,000. Every last man of them an American. The blistering heat of the days of fighting had ended, and rain began to fall. Soon it was a deluge. After 2 years of victories, General Lee had met a shattering defeat at Gettysburg. He turned his army back toward Virginia. The wagon train carrying Confederate wounded stretched 17 miles. Gettysburg is a town and a battlefield in Pennsylvania, but it's also a glorious American memory. When we tell and retell the stories of the brave men who fought here, we're paying tribute to their valor, their strength of purpose, their patriotism. These are noble virtues, and the soldiers of Gettysburg have earned a place in our hearts. But the Civil War was a dark time of anguish and suffering for America. The wounds are healed now, and the scars are faint. The country is changed, but whole again. Perhaps that's partly why we come here. Perhaps Gettysburg tells us not only of our heroes, but also of differences overcome, of brotherhood restored. This place reassures us that the country survived that dreadful shock and has endured. On November 19, 1863, a little more than 4 months after the Battle of Gettysburg, President Abraham Lincoln delivered an address here at the dedication of the National Cemetery. Today, a memorial honors that famous event, the only monument ever erected to commemorate a speech. A large crowd of people, including Union soldiers who had fought here, gathered for the ceremonies. President Lincoln spoke near where the Soldiers' National Monument now stands. His carefully composed address transformed the Gettysburg battlefield from a place of appalling carnage into a national symbol, an American shrine. Spoken in the midst of war, his deathless words conveyed inspiration and hope to his listeners. They have done the same for generations of Americans ever since.
77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
We're tenting tonight on the old campground. Give us a song to cheer our weary hearts, a song of home and friends we love so dear. Many are the hearts that are weary tonight, wishing for the war to cease. Many are the hearts that are looking for the right to see the dawn of peace. Many are the hearts that are weary tonight, wishing for the war to cease. Many are the hearts that are looking for the right to see the dawn of peace. night.